it would ultimately lead to World War III because Putin won't back down. Zelensky's insistence that we will not give up any territory in Ukraine ever to Russia. It's like, seriously, what planet are you on? Do you want to keep fighting for another 10 years? There's already been 1 million dead, at least.
And almost every war ends in negotiation and treaties.
When this war is over, and it will end, all the people who said that stand with Ukraine will never say it again.
Is bad peace better than a good war? At this moment in history, we are living through unprecedented times with global conflicts raging, and seemingly those who have previously stood for peace are now making out that the peacemakers are the bad guys. In today's episode, I'm joined by the Reverend Dr. Michael J. Sutton, who is a political economist, professional author, a priest, a pastor, and a publisher. He's the CEO of Freedom Matters Today, looking at freedom from a Christian perspective. And today we're going to be exploring his views on the Ukraine conflict. Reverend Michael Sutton, it's great to have you on the Astin-Gregory podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So
Thank you very much for inviting me.
we found your work through the Bad Peace, Better Than a Good War article that you published on Brownstone. And I was fascinated to read that. And it was one of the first articles that I've come across that really kind of resonated me from a point of view of understanding these different lenses that we can look at this conflict through, and how almost the world is turned upside down when it comes to pursuing towards peace. Tell us a little bit about just the title for the first point. What did you mean by bad peace is better than a good war?
Well, bad peace is always better than a good war. There's no such thing as a good war. And I think everyone who has participated in war on both sides of every conflict would much rather that they never did. I think for me, it really is summarized by a conversation or a talk I heard a few years ago when I was serving as a priest in the country. There was a man who was giving a talk, and he was as hard as nails, those real country type, real strong people, strong men. And he was talking at the Anzac Day memorial service, and he in the middle of it, he started talking about the Battle of Long Tan, and he was there. He was in that battle, and he was talking about how his mate got up onto the APC with his machine gun and was firing into the Viet Cong. And this strong man broke down and cried, and he just wept publicly. And for me, it was a very touching and profound moment, not only because he was really tough. He was a horseman. He bred horses, he rode horses, he's in the rodeo and all those kinds of things in Australia, and they're tough men. And here he was in this public arena talking about the Battle of Long Tan, and he was weeping and crying. And for me, I was really struck by that, because that was 1966. And here we are, this was in 2017. And this man has lived with that nightmare his entire life, and it has profoundly influenced him. And I had the privilege of ministering to a number of men in the country who all served in Vietnam. And they were great blokes, they were great men. But you could see the impact of that war, which everyone's forgotten, of course. That's a long time ago, the fall of Saigon. There are parallels, of course, with the fall of Afghanistan and how the Americans scurried away from Afghanistan, brought back memories of the ghost of the fall of Saigon. But it just reminded me how awful war is. And we look at Vietnam today, and we have Vietnamese restaurants in Sydney, and we enjoy their food, and we have lots of Vietnamese Australians, and you wonder, what was it all about? And so everyone who serves in war, everyone who fights in war suffers the awful tragedy of war, not just those who fight, but those whom they leave behind, and those who have to carry them when they come back. And if you look at the war in terror, for example, the Australian contingents that went off to fight in various places, and probably there's the same with the British soldiers who went to fight. There are more who suffer after the conflict than those who suffered during the conflict in terms of psychological damage, and we know a lot more about it these days. And so at the end of the day, really, there's no such thing as a good war, because everyone who participates in the war, particularly those who are on the front line and the families of those who are being affected, and of course the victims of war, those who are killed and those who are maimed and blown to pieces, their lives are forever ruined. And for what? And at the end of the day, when there is an opportunity for two sides to sit down and say, okay, well, we have these disagreements, let's work it out, let's have a ceasefire, and let's come to some kind of agreement, then it doesn't really matter at the end of the day what that agreement looks like, if there is a cessation of conflict. And we see that particularly it's more acute these days because we experience industrial conflict. In centuries gone by, we use spears and bows and arrows, but these days we use drones and missiles, and it doesn't matter what you put on the ground in Ukraine. Australia sent Bushmasters made by the French, I think, to Ukraine. The Russians can blow them up with a missile. The Russian tanks can be blown up by American missiles. There's almost nothing that can be really sustained on the battlefield these days. Aircraft carriers are just a target. Submarines can be blown to pieces. And that's why, of course, Donald Trump is talking about this golden dome. I'm not entirely sure why he's calling it the golden dome. Is it sort of going to be made of gold,
Yeah.
or what is it about? Or maybe he just thinks that's the best metal for the future. Forget about Fort Knox. We'll just put it above America. But it's the same thing. It's there's always going to be someone with better technology to kill people, and that's effectively what war is about.
Yeah. So, Michael, you've made a really strong argument, but I can imagine some people watching this will hear what you've just said and say, actually, Michael, there is a good war, because this whole narrative has been reduced down to kind of good versus, oversimplified to this good versus evil, and therefore, Putin attacked Ukraine, and therefore, Ukraine have to defend themselves, and justice must be served, and negotiation can't lead to justice if we are going to cease war like this, and cede land. And I think that has become the kind of dominant narrative in Europe, and therefore people are actually rebelling against the idea of actually ceasing the war, which I find astounding, because what's the alternative? The alternative is a war of attrition, a forever war, if you like, or even escalation. So in your view, how has this kind of point of moral absolutism kind of permeated our culture, whereby, and by the way, in me saying this, I don't agree with Putin's attack on Ukraine. I fundamentally don't agree with it, but I also understand that there's a broader narrative, there's broader complexities than the simplicity of Putin invaded Ukraine. There's a history, there's motive that people are often willing to overlook as part of this moral absolutism, this almost ideological viewpoint that's radically oversimplified and heavily emotionalized. But when you bring it back to the kind of logic, if we do continue this war, then the tragedy that will continue in the way that you've described, the loss of life, the sacrifices that will have to be made, for what purpose? Will we actually get to justice? What do people actually want? They want to see an end of Putin. Well, if you want to see an end of Putin, are you willing to endure World War III to get that? How do you think we've got to this place where this kind of relentless I stand with Ukraine mentality has permeated society without any kind of reference to what it actually means, to do that?
Well, the Stand with Ukraine movement is a pivot away from COVID hysteria. And COVID hysteria, as you know, and you and I have both been profoundly influenced by COVID hysteria, for good or ill. I don't think either of us would be where we are if it were not for that nightmare, the unholy trinity of vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, and lockdowns. And so I think both of us have recoiled from that, and we are trying to make sense of that. And that really could only happen because of the brainwashing and indoctrination of our populations. And what it was effectively a loyalty test. And in my view, what we've seen in democracy, in our liberal democratic systems in the last decade or so, is the decline in democratic institutions and the emergence of fascism. And I would argue that fascism is an inevitable result of democratic decline. And you see the rise of corporate power, the rise of the decline of representation, and so on. The rise of, I guess, of corporate control of the state. And we saw this first. It first reared its head when Trump was elected the first time, and the loyalty test was you have to hate Trump. That was the dominant thing. That was the loyalty test. If you didn't hate Trump, there was something wrong with you. What's wrong with you? People would say. You have to hate Trump. And if you said the words, if you uttered the mantra, everything was okay. You got that job. You were welcome in family conversation. And that was a bit disturbing. And then when we had COVID, we had the loyalty test was you must be vaccinated. And if you're not vaccinated, you're not one of us. You're out. And they went out of their way to really persecute people who were not vaccinated. They went out of the way to, in a sense, corral them, persecute them, harass them. In Australia, the government was encouraging citizens to dob in their neighbour, their friends and family. In Melbourne, the police were running around shooting people with rubber bullets for daring to have a cup of coffee. Really, in Melbourne and Australia, in Sydney, it was a nightmare. Thankfully, most of these fascist wannabes have left the political scene, and they're gone, hopefully for good. But the loyalty test was there. And then in the middle of COVID, we had the conflict in Ukraine that appeared. And then the new loyalty test was stand with Ukraine. And it appeared almost automatically. And within a week, the mass media, the fake news media in particular, they were promoting the stand with Ukraine mantra. And once again, if you don't agree with it, you're out. You're out of the system. You're an outcast or whatever. You have to stand with Ukraine. And I believe that this nightmare of stand with Ukraine is coming to an end with Trump's peace plan proposal, and he ran with this for his re-election. This wasn't something that he dropped out of the sky. He ran with the proposal that he would bring this conflict to an end, and the American people voted overwhelmingly to re-elect Donald Trump. And so he has a mandate to promote this plan because that's what he was elected to do. That's what they call democracy. People are elected and they have a proposal and that's their platform and they have their mandate. And so when he had his proposal that he wanted to have peace, the mainstream media who don't believe in democracy, the ones who promoted this war and these loyalty tests, and their friends in government, and they opposed it. And so what's the new loyalty test? Well, if Biden was elected, I think the new loyalty test was going to be climate hysteria, and that's been nipped in the bud. And I predicted back in when was it? A few months, August 2023. I said that the one of the new loyalty tests, I guess the new thing that was going to happen was a new Holocaust. That was a few months before October the 7th. So it just seemed to me that really is sort of something that was going to happen. And a few months later, we have the Hamas nightmare and we have the Gaza genocide and everything from there. So it's about the loyalty tests, and really for you and I, it is about indoctrination and brainwashing. And you see it. I was at a meeting recently where I wanted to say something, and everyone was talking about standing with Ukraine, and everyone got really upset and angry. And I thought, oh, there's no point having a conversation here because it's the same with lots of these controversial issues. There's no point having an argument if you know that it's just going to be people arguing for no reason. But again, I think we have to look at the reality, and the reality is that the Ukrainians at the beginning of this conflict, particularly the first 72 hours, the first few days from February 22nd onwards, they put up quite a resistance to the Russians and caught the Russians off guard in a sense. And so a negotiation process began almost immediately. And there was what was called the Istanbul communique. We don't really know what was in that because no one has produced a copy of that. But essentially what it was the idea that the Crimea and Sevastopol would be, I guess, isolated. They would be given some kind of immunity from negotiation. The two republics that declared independence in 2014, Donetsk and Luhansk, they would be given special status within Ukraine, some kind of special republic or slash autonomy or whatever. And there would be a discussion about the military, and also Ukraine would be neutral, would be regarded as neutral. That was sort of what they were talking about. And when Trump comes up with a peace plan, and when the British and French decide on a peace plan, that is essentially what will happen. There will be a discussion on the future of Crimea. And I suspect Crimea and Sevastopol will be set aside for a future date. I suspect that Luhansk and Donetsk will be given some kind of autonomy, republic status, some kind of, I guess, like autonomous regional authority or whatever within Ukraine, perhaps. And then the other territories that Russia has claimed, there's a few regions that Russia's claimed, they'll be swapped for Kursk, which the Ukrainians stole a few months ago. And so what they've been doing effectively for the last 3 years have been setting up the negotiating platform for a peace treaty. And so if the end result is what they were going to decide upon 3 years ago, then why did we have 3 years of war? It's a completely pointless conflict. And they'll spin it whichever way they want to spin it, but they have to resolve those essential issues: the question of the Crimea, the question of those two republics, which is what the war was over in the first place. And I don't suspect the Russians will hold on to those other territories. Zelensky's insistence that we will not give up any territory in Ukraine ever to Russia. It's like, seriously, what planet are you on? Do you want to keep fighting for another 10 years? I suspect, as I wrote in the article, and I was in Russia 2 years ago, and I had the opportunity of speaking to a few people there, but my impression of the conflict, it's like the Western Front. It's like the battle of, I guess, the Western Front. It was trench warfare. There's a line straight down the eastern side of Ukraine, and there's no progress. And if you know anything about the Western Front, it was a nightmare. And it's been going on for 3 years. And it doesn't matter how much weaponry America or Europe provides or how much weaponry the Russians use. At the end of the day, that eastern line will stay intact. And I mean, if you want to keep fighting for another 10 years, you're looking at, there's already been 1 million dead, at least. I would suspect more than that. In terms of the collapse of the economy, the Ukrainian economy has collapsed. There are almost all of the wealthy Ukrainians no longer live in Ukraine. They're here in Australia. They're in London. They're in Paris. So what are they going to do when the war's over? I have a feeling they probably don't want to go back. Why would you want to go back? The place is just a basket case economy. There's massive corruption now. The democracy is now over. So I can understand the reasoning for people who want to continue the conflict, but at the end of the day, we're looking at more dead, more destruction, more chaos, and more millions of people suffering psychological damage for the rest of their lives. And the end result will probably be the basic contours of the Istanbul Communique or something like it. So in other words, what was the war about in the first place?
Yes,
if it could have been over in
prolonging
2
what
months.
is seemingly the inevitable. And it feels like there's a distinct polarity between the United States approach and Europe. Europe almost seemed to be angling for that forever war type approach, delay, attrition, hoping that Putin will capitulate, potentially roll back on some of the negotiations and make concessions of his own. And perhaps that would happen. Perhaps Russia over 10 years would lose, interest in certain things because their own economy becomes so depleted. But at what cost? At the moment, European countries and world economies are funneling billions into this war. It's not just lives lost. It's national economies that are being depleted to support this war, this forever war, the idea of the forever war, whereas Trump has come in and whether you think he's orange bad man or you think he's America's peacekeeper, it doesn't really matter. That what the U.S. administration are moving towards is the idea that we can put an end to this conflict and find a solution within the parameters that you've outlined. Now, with those parameters in your definition of the article, would that be considered bad peace, or is that good peace, or is there no such thing as bad peace? Where does that fit on the line?
Well, because I don't stand with Ukraine and I refuse to play any of these loyalty test games, it would be regarded as they would say I'm an apologist for Russia, or I'm a supporter of the of whom they're calling the new Hitler. But Putin isn't Hitler, and my estimation of the conflict is that it is such a violent and destructive one. And it's quite unlike anything we've seen since Bosnia. And Bosnia, people forget Bosnia. They say that this is the first conflict since in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Well, we had Bosnia. That was a nightmare, um, and that destroyed tens of millions of people in their lives. We've forgotten that conflict. But it's a terrible war, and it doesn't matter what the Russians or the Ukrainians, through the provision of the gifts that they're being given from the West, throw at this battle. The industrial power of militarism at the moment is such that neither side really has an edge in terms of technological development. So this isn't like the Zulu Wars where they were running around shooting people with spears. They both have the same capabilities. They're in a stalemate. And then there was the Kursk incursion by the Ukrainians to invade a part of Russia that is of no importance to either Ukraine or Russia. And again, this is all about the bargaining process. I would say that Putin had a plan. He had a goal, which was to protect those Luhansk and Donetsk. That was his main goal, and also to defend the Crimea. The Europeans definitely don't have an end game or an exit strategy. It is one of the worst run wars in history. If you want to fight a war, you have to have an exit strategy or an end game. The Israelis have an end game with Gaza. Their goal is to ethnically cleanse the entire Israel or Palestine area of anyone who's not Jewish and create the greater Israel. That's their goal. They've stated that many times. That's their end game strategy, to push everyone out, send them to other countries. So we can applaud that and say, at least you've got a strategy. We know where you're going, what your strategy is, but we have no idea what the British strategy is. Then we have the British proposal of using the $350 billion worth of Russian assets that they've stolen for war to help prop up the British war effort in Ukraine. And the French said, well, this is a terrible thing to do because this could set a precedent. Who knows what will happen in the future? Maybe the Chinese might take our resources. Well, that's exactly what will happen. And so that is another nightmare. And it is all indicative of this push towards global conflict with China, which really, I believe, this is what this is about. And if you read between the lines at the moment, the French and the British militaries are saying, well, we've learned a lot in this conflict. This is really helpful. We've learnt many different strategies and had lots of insights, and this will help us in the next conflict. So the people of Ukraine, they've suffered death and destruction because the British and French militaries want to learn a few things for their next conflict. And you also have to remember, too, Dan, that in August 2021, there was the departure from Afghanistan by the American forces, and that was long overdue, but the way it was handled was a complete catastrophe. $50 billion or whatever worth of US equipment was left in Afghanistan, and so for the Taliban to pick up, and they have that now, all that money. And then within 6 months, we have the war in Ukraine. And so I have this image. I mean, it's not true, of course, but I have this enduring image of Biden sort of wandering around the White House eating an ice cream. I don't know why I have that image, but he's wandering around, and he eventually finds the command and control room, and in there are all the usual suspects. I won't say who they are. If you follow Ukrainian affairs, you'll know who I'm talking about. And there's a big map of the world, and there's a red marker circle around Ukraine with arrows pointing to Ukraine. And they say to Biden, well, Mr. Biden, this is where the next war will be. And he said, okay, that's fine. I need another ice cream. And he walks out again. And that's effectively what happened. And so we've had for 3 years, the British, the French, the Australians, the Americans have tested every conceivable weapon that they've built in the last 50 years in that theatre. And so, once again, the Ukrainian people can thank the war manufacturers of the world for doing them a great service and testing all the weapons, seeing how bombs explode, how they kill children, how they destroy buildings, how they travel long distances. And for 3 years, we've had live testing of these weapons of mass destruction. They weren't in Iraq. They were, of course, made by the weapons manufacturers of the world. And so, in a sense, these you can't really blame them. I mean, they're vultures, they're hyenas, I suppose, of the global corporate scene. They need to feast, and they need an outlet to sell and produce their weapons. And the British government recently has said, which is not a good sign, that the defence industry is a source for future economic growth. It's good for jobs. So blowing people up overseas will be good for the economy. Well, it really depends, doesn't it, which economy you're talking about. But that's what you have. And you have these corporations that they needed to feast. And so they were looking around for another conflict, and we found Ukraine. And Ukraine has been it. And so the question that really worries me is because these corporations, Dan, are massive. They're huge corporations, and they employ hundreds of thousands of people, and they make bombs all the time, missiles and so on. So Trump is saying that we're going to end the war in Ukraine. Fine, okay, great. Where's the next war that will satisfy the appetite of all these war corporations? And recently this week, I think the Panama Canal Company is selling all their assets to an American company because they know that Panama was next on the list for invasion. Be interesting to see what happens in Greenland, whether America puts a very large military base in Greenland. So the question is, where will the next war be? Because the war machine is uncontrollable. And but you're right. They're right. With the Ukraine conflict under the old regime, which was the Biden administration, they were pushing further and further into Russia, which may lead to nuclear holocaust. And people have this fantasy about nuclear weapons. They think that you can have a limited nuclear war, but you can't. The Russian system is on automatic pilot. Once it starts, it will never stop. Every capital in the world will be destroyed. And there are a couple of loonies in the American administration, in the Biden camp, who were stupid, and they were clearly stupid in expecting that Putin would fall. And I think also, Dan, we have to realize that the American state, even though it is monolithic, it is still run by people, and often those people have made large strategic errors. And we saw with the fall of the Shah of Iran, they didn't know that was going to happen. The Bay of Pigs fiasco, that was run by the CIA, that was a disaster. And so there have been many cases where the so-called monolithic superpower of the security state has made some massive strategic errors. And this war in Ukraine is definitely one of them. And so my view is that there was a shift in thinking within the ruling class in America, that the people running this war needed to be taken out. There needed to be a clearing of the state, and there needed to be, I guess, a realignment of America's strategic priorities, because it would ultimately lead to World War III, because Putin won't back down. There are two groups of people. I'm just saying it. This is what they are. I'm not making any value judgments about it. But there are two groups of people in the world you don't want to mess with, because you won't win. One, of course, is Israel, and the other one is Russia. You don't want to mess with the Russians. The Germans tried to; they lost. The French under Napoleon tried to; they lost. Russia is a superpower, even though it's not as strong as America. But you don't want to mess with the Russians; they're never going to give up. And so, but the Americans knew that, and I suspect that the Americans were the first to give up on the stupidity of this war, whereas the British and the French, because of their history with Russia, their hatred of Russia, it goes back centuries. They're much more willing to keep it going. And of course, Britain has its own agenda. And I think it's interesting that Britain wants nothing to do with Europe, but they want to support Ukraine. So it's an interesting thing. We could talk a little bit about the British motivation.
As you've mentioned it, I am interested. Obviously, we've got a new government, relatively new government here under Starmer. This Sunday, at the point of recording this, that's just passed, Starmer invited European leaders, Canada, various others, Zelensky, for another summit on Ukraine. And, I was very clear in my kind of post on this, is that this is not a path to peace. This is a path to prolongation. This is a path to funding the war for a longer duration. And lo and behold, that seems to be the outcome. Although there is still mutterings of moving towards peace, I just don't see that within the European strategy. And I don't know. I mean, every day, Starmer's posting something or speaking about, how, again, with the loyalty test, standing with Ukraine, and they'll do everything in their power to support Ukraine. But the rhetoric isn't about peace. It's largely not about bringing it to a peaceful conclusion. So there is this polarization, so even though, yes, the UK is not part of Europe anymore in terms of the European Union, but it has aligned. In the political alignment is there, even if the public alignment isn't fully there when it comes to the discussion around the EU. There's plenty of people in the UK who have passed the I stand with Ukraine loyalty test, even if they blindly do so without really understanding Ukraine, why they support Ukraine, etc., etc. But I'm curious about what you think Starmer's motives are in this conflict. What does he stand to gain himself from prolonging this? And what we don't have in the UK is any. There's a very limited voice that is challenging Starmer on this. There's a very limited, which again is shocking because he's actually part of the war machine now. And where is the peace movement in the United Kingdom? I haven't found it. So not long after this conversation is published, I would have gone on and started it myself. I'm not standing by. Just like the same thing happened in COVID. I can't stand on the sidelines and watch anymore as political leaders ransack our future. But that's a conversation for another time. So I'm curious, what do you think, Starmer? What is Britain's interest in prolonging this war?
Yeah, well, Britain, Starmer, he's Sir
apologies.
Starmer, isn't he? Oh, that's. I think there's your answer. He's a member of the establishment. He's a traitor to the working class, if you want to use the old Marxist term.
Yeah.
He's Labour Party, isn't he? He's Labour. He's about as he's a traitor to the working class. He's happy to see them get slaughtered in the battlefield. Starmer's come up with this 100-year partnership with Ukraine, which is bizarre in itself because it suggests it's just a strange thing, but not a 10-year plan or 50-year plan, but a century of partnership with Ukraine. And there's an interesting clause in there in the security section of that partnership declaration, and that is this sort of mutual defence agreement that they've made. So the idea is the British have parroted the NATO provisions, which essentially say that if one member of NATO is attacked by a foreign power, then other members of NATO will come to their aid. And so what they've done in this partnership agreement is parrot that clause, and they've inserted it into the 100-year declaration, which seems to suggest that NATO, for me, NATO, I mean, this is an awful thing to say, NATO is basically Britain and America, effectively. Historically, they've been the two pillars of NATO and France to some degree, but the whole purpose of Europe was I think Ismay was the one who said the purpose of Europe was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was the purpose of Europe and NATO, and that's been a failure. Germany is back and brighter than ever, and they want their slice of history again. Germany is rearmed. They're providing a lot more weapons around the world. So NATO has been a bit of a failure in that sense. But for me, so what Starmer's done with this declaration is he has guaranteed Ukraine the kind of de facto NATO membership that he wants, but with the British, which if you are going to place a bet with anyone in Europe that will have your back, then probably the British are the ones to go with, because they're the ones who have backed every military war in the 20th century with vigor. They love war, with the war on terror in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Britain's always there to support the United States. The French sort of equivocate. The Germans, they're sort of stuck in the war guilt. And the rest of the other European countries they don't know whether they're coming or going. So in terms of Europe, Britain is effectively the power that Zelensky would want to have if he wants any security guarantees. So when he's talking about security guarantees, he doesn't need any more. He's got the British on his side with this partnership agreement, which effectively guarantees that in the future, if Russia invades Ukraine again, then the British are bound by this treaty or this declaration to support the Ukraine. And so that's a very important strategic process within the British state, I guess, to bolster this potential partnership. But the other thing is that as I said before, Ukraine's been obliterated in this war. And so the reconstruction bill is going to be astronomical, and the British want access to the public sector corporations. They want to privatize most of the Ukraine with British companies. The French do as well. So it's going to be one giant marketplace, sort of bargain basement sale for privatization. So once the war is over, the European powers will just go in like a bunch of vultures and help themselves to whatever they can get. The Americans have got in first with their minerals deal, and Zelensky huffed and puffed and did his tantrum in the White House and said he didn't like being treated the way he was. He rushed like a little boy back to England. And I thought it was really interesting because I've been wondering who is really controlling Zelensky. I thought for a long while it was Biden's men and Biden's people, but I think in the last week I realized it was actually the British. The British control Zelensky. He is more of a puppet of the British state rather than the American state, which also kind of explains the two tantrums that he's had. He had a tantrum with Biden back in, I think, June 2022, where he lost it. And the Americans were giving him billions of weapons. And in this phone conversation, Zelensky then just tells Biden off, we want more. And Biden says, look, you don't talk to us like that. And the same thing happened with Trump. And you have this little schoolboy yelling in tantrum like, I want more, give me more. And the Americans were just shocked. You don't talk to us like that. We're the leader of the free world. Show us a little bit of respect. And so as soon as this conversation is over, he rushes back to England to his minders. And so Zelensky is, I guess, in a sense, he's very much aligned with Britain. And then after a few days of huffing and puffing, he appears again and says, oh, okay, I agree to everything the Americans have said. Well, who told him to say that? It wasn't the Americans. The Americans are very upset with him. The Americans don't just do a backflip and then after you've offended them a few days later, all is forgiven. No, they're not like that. They take these things seriously. If you offend the Americans, they're going to be offended. So Zelensky returns a few days later and says, I'm really sorry. I think Americans have a really good deal with the minerals, and let's start again. And that's, of course, his conversations with the Europeans, because he knows that there's we're now in the post-war period of this conflict, and the bargaining will begin. Who gets what in Ukraine? Ukraine is a large slab of beef, and everyone's going to get their cut. And that's basically what the war was about. Australia? What's Australia? Why is Australia in Ukraine? We sent these trucks that were built. I didn't even know we built them. And they're called the Bushmaster. Well, they were blown to pieces on the battlefield because they're trucks. But Australia is throwing its hat in the ring. We want a little bit of the pie. The Japanese have rearmed through Ukraine, seeing this as their opportunity to reassert their imperial power. And one thing I noticed when I was in Japan the last few times after COVID, which is quite disturbing, and that there is a real rise in in Shintoism again, which was never there when I lived in Japan for 10 years, and I never noticed any real Shinto worship aside from the seasonal stuff. But what I did notice in Japan is that a lot of Japanese have returned to state Shintoism. They're very much interested in the role of the emperor, and we're seeing the rise of the right, and the Ukraine war has elevated Japan again, which is not a good sign for the future. But the Japanese want their slice of Ukraine as well. I think the Japanese this week, they came out and they couldn't say who they agreed with because they didn't want to offend anyone. And so they said, we agree with Zelensky, and with Trump and with the British. So they're trying to, they're typically diplomatic. They just don't know who to agree with. And so that's the Japanese. But everyone's got their finger in the pie. And if I was a Ukrainian, I would be outraged because these countries don't care about the Ukrainian people. All they care about is money and power. And Ukraine, whatever's left of it after this conflict, is going to be cut up like a piece of meat and given to the highest bidder. And there are a lot of Ukrainians who are really not going to be happy with the ending of the war, but they're also not going to be happy with what the West will do with Ukraine when it's all over.
Yeah, I mean, and all of that you've mentioned will all be sold under the idea of rebuilding Ukraine. We're partnering with Ukraine. It's all going to be sold under the idea of this, greater good. We're here to support Ukraine through, the transition phase. Yeah, it's really about commercializing their investment because, quite frankly, if you're going to invest billions in war, as a nation state, you may have some kickback from the military industrial complex, but ultimately this now is the feast phase, which is quite frankly disgusting, but it will be billed as something good. On this related point, I suppose, looking at kind of Starmer's rhetoric on this, he does talk about the lines about moving towards peace, but I think Starmer's philosophy, which aligns with the broader British way that you touched upon, is this idea of peace through strength, which in Britain is kind of tantamount to peace through war. And actually, many nations that talk about peace through strength actually mean peace through war because of some of the reasons you outlined. From a Christian perspective, is any war ever justified? I'm curious to know. And I know that's a blanket question, and I'm not supposing that you are going to give the ultimate word of God on on war, but just from the kind of Christian teachings, what role does war play, and is it ever justified?
It's a really good question, Dan. The answer is, well, from my perspective, there is no just war. From my understanding of the New Testament and of the teachings of Jesus, Jesus said very clearly that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God, which implies very strongly that those who promote peace are the children of God and those who promote war are not the children of God. And he also says, and it's a very difficult passage to read and difficult to apply. And we have to, I guess, for many of us, we as Christians, we struggle with it because it is difficult. And he says we must love our enemies. And we must do good to those who persecute us. And for me, it is a very difficult thing to do. And because we do have people we don't like, and when you compound this to situations of war and conflict, it becomes even more acute. I guess from a Christian perspective, I believe that the motivation for us to love others is because we believe that while we were the enemies of God, that Christ died for us. And so we believe that Jesus' death on the cross, dying for sin while we were his enemies, we were at enmity with God. And so as a result of that, God sending his son when we were at enmity with him and dying for our sin, that is a motivation for us to love others. If God so loves us with such compassion when we were his enemies and he died for our sins when we had no reason for him to do so, how much more ought we to love those whom we see as enemies? But it also goes right back, I think, Dan, to the idea of who we see as enemies. And this again goes to nationalism. And nationalism has effectively won. Christendom was a failure because Christendom was the church state. And once the church had the sword, they just started killing people. Then we had the empires, which we had the British Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the other empires. Now we have the American Empire. And it's the same thing. It is sort of Christians with the state, and it involves killing and patriotism and so on. And then now we have nations, and nations effectively is the same thing. But Christians are called to be people of peace. And it's incompatible for Christians to promote war, to pursue war. And Paul, who was a terrorist, St. Paul was a terrorist. He enjoyed killing people who weren't Jewish, and until he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, as you probably are familiar with that story. And and he was knocked off his horse, and he had this vision of Jesus, and Jesus said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And so Paul is the one who tells us that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And so for me, we don't actually wrestle against humans, because humans are made in the image of God. And this is what it says in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, that we are made in the image of God. And all Christians who follow Jesus or aspire to follow Jesus believe that they are being transformed into the image of Christ. And so if we are people who have been, I guess, loved by God and saved by God, and Jesus has died for our sins, and we are called to be people of peace and love, when do we have time to kill other people? Where do we fit that in? Is it after Mass on Sunday? Is it after we go to church and we go off and then sign our little missiles to God with love? It's incompatible with Christianity. And it's interesting, the church has a differing perspective. They say there is a just war, but if you look at when they devised the just war theory, the just war theory was devised by theologians who wanted to go to war, and they wanted to kill people. So they just came up with the theory: there is a just war. This justifies killing people, but you're killing people made in the image of God, and you're killing people who for whom Christ died, and you're killing people for whom God loves. And I think for me, being a Christian, and that's what I wrote. I wrote this book 3 years ago. Is Russia our enemy? Amazon's banned the advertising because they didn't like it. But I set out those arguments that as Christians we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities and powers, and diabolos, or the devil, spiritual forces, but also we wrestle against ourselves. I think too. I think our own hearts, and we do this particularly with COVID hysteria and all the other loyalty tests, where we are. I guess we have forfeited our power to the state. We have conferred our power to the state. We've handed it over to the state, and what we've done is we've enabled the state to enslave us. And we did that. We gave the state our heart, mind, and soul, and we need to get it back again as a society and as people. And for me, I realized after a couple of years I wrote books on COVID hysteria, on fascism, on Ukraine, on Gaza. Last year I wrote 3 books on war, and so 10 books in my series since November 2022 on the Christian response or Christian perspective to these things. And what I came back to was that I really needed to go back to the fundamentals, and that is, with the Christian faith, that is the person of Jesus. And I believe that Jesus is the presence, the power, and the person of God. And for me, he says just before he's about to be crucified, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were so, my disciples would fight." And I thought, well, okay, Jesus' disciples are not fighting for this world. Fine. There it is. And there is a degree to freedom. You can, the Bible God doesn't prohibit us from fighting for our nation. And I think it's a great honor for anyone to do that. And often people do fight for their country. But you have to remember that God doesn't take sides in war. You have in this stupid conflict in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are Orthodox. The Russians are Orthodox. They're both in the same denomination. They both pray to the same God. They both have the same mass. They both have the same priesthood. And yet they're killing each other. Same with the English Civil War. If you remember the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, one was the Puritans, and they prayed to the same God. And so you have this stupidity of war. And so a lot of this has to do with territory and power and states. And at the end of the day, governments surely in this day and age can come to some kind of agreement. But as far as the Bible is concerned, we are to be people of peace, because God
Thank you,
is a God
Michael.
of peace.
Yeah, hopefully you'll take this piece in a playful sense that it's intended. But I'd actually written down that quote to discuss with you. Blessed are the peacemakers, and the Bible is obviously one of the most well-known and iconic texts in the world. Perhaps a lesser known text, but equally iconic, is Orwell's 1984, which states that war is peace. And I think that is the kind of mentality that we're being sold at the moment, which is directly in contradiction to what you've just shared. And this idea that the peacemakers are bad, the peacemakers are the troublemakers, the peacemakers are the enemy. This is how it's been framed now. And I get it all the time. I get called naive. I get called uninformed. I get called a Putinite, and I have no interest in Putin. I have no interest in his agenda. I respect the Russian people as I respect the Ukrainian people, and both sides of that equation are suffering. But I ultimately stand for the principle of peace, and the fastest, most lean way to get there is in my view, negotiation. But this Ukraine, to circle back to this kind of Ukraine loyalty test, it's now a new loyalty test whether you actually back the prolongation of this war and support the narrative. You've written about mass formation from a Christian perspective through the COVID response. How do you see this as now applied to this idea specifically of peacemakers being the enemy? I mean, how have people been indoctrinated to actually and actually liberals who have historically been the ones who championed diplomacy and peace are now using moral absolutism and ideological arguments to justify the continuation of war, and therefore those who are seeking peace are the enemy? How did we get here?
That's a really good question, Dan. We could talk about this for a long time. I think one of the things I've noticed and that really surprised me was I always thought that as our society became more and more complex with the advent of computers and technology and so on, that eventually everything would be in sort of hues and shades and degrees.
Yeah.
But the opposite happened.
Binaries.
The opposite happened. So we reverted to absolutes. Everything became black and white, up and down, left or right. I don't believe left or right even means anything anymore. But and so we're in this absolutism, and it's almost like what I call sandpit psychology. And if you remember, as a kid, I don't know what you did as a kid, Dan, but we used to play in the sandpit as kids, and there were goodies and baddies, and there were cops and robbers. And there's a few other things that have sort of fallen out of vogue, but there were goodies and baddies essentially, and that was the sandpit when we were kids. Then we grew up and we realized that the world was more complex. But what's happened now with propaganda and indoctrination is that the state believes that we're stupid, and they want us to remain stupid and dumb, and so they've forced us back into the sandpit again and said, "Well, you're not intelligent enough to work out the subtleties and the nuances." And I addressed that in my Brownstone article, that, for example, the complex history of Ukraine, where there are Ukrainian nationalists who supported Hitler. There were Ukrainian nationalists who were involved in the genocide of the Holocaust. But it was complicated in the sense that they hated Stalin as well. And so the Germans were the liberators of Ukraine from their point of view. So there is this sort of, yes, they were collaborators. Yes, they did kill the Jews. But in the context of that history, the Ukrainians would say that they were also people who resisted Stalin. And so Stalin was a lunatic as well. And so history doesn't give us usually doesn't give us doesn't force us to make these absolutist decisions. The politicians do that, and the media does that. And the other funny thing, of course, is that we have so much history at the moment. You go online, there's the History Channel, and there's all these other ones, and they provide this subtlety and this nuance and this historical context. But when it comes to politics, it's almost like there is a different logic. And so my article, the Brownstone one I wrote, would be dismissed as Russian disinformation. Now, disinformation effectively means, it doesn't mean it's untrue. And we saw this with COVID. It doesn't mean it's untrue. It doesn't mean you're lying, but it's not presenting the position that we want you to understand. So in other words, it doesn't fit with our presuppositions or our assumptions. It's not wrong, but it's not the information that we want to give you. And so with COVID, we were told that, when people questioned the vaccine and they said people were dying from There were the excess death debates, and there were the people were dying from the vaccine and so on. And the government said, "Oh, there's no evidence to say that this is related to the vaccine." Well, how did they know? Anyone who says this is guilty of misinformation or disinformation. And so, what it is about preventing discussion and preventing debate. And this is all indicative of a collapsing society. And the Marxists say, and Marx said that capitalism would eventually die because growth would eventually stop. And the contradictions that underpin the capitalist system, which is the Marxists would say the class conflict, would basically result in the collapse of the system. And that's simply what the Great Reset is all about. They've just deleted a little bit from Marx, the class conflict, and they're saying exactly the same thing. But we see this too with the development of our society, and that the high growth period is over. There are massive problems in our society. We have in Europe, we're lucky in Australia, says where we have an ocean around us. We can send off the illegal migrants to Nauru and put them in offshore detention centres and let them rot for 20 years. I mean, that's a human rights abuse, of course. I'm just being sarcastic. But the British, of course, Britain is an island as well, but the Europeans are suffering this migrant crisis. There's wokeism in Europe, and this is all indicative of a collapsing society. And so it's about the old economic prosperity that gave us the freedom to think and speak clearly is gone. And I think that really capitalism that emerged in the 19th century in Britain and went to the United States and Europe and Australia from about the 1850s to until the 1960s, so only about 100 years, enabled us to have this period of freedom and of free expression and so on. But that time is coming to an end because prosperity gave us democracy and we had the luxury of speaking our own mind. But society is falling apart. And governments can't, for whatever reason, they can't sustain economic growth. And everything's been falling apart since the 70s when Keynesianism collapsed. And so they've been grappling for different strategies, monetarism, globalism, neoliberalism, and they still haven't found one yet after 50 years. And so we now have the rise of China, the rise of Russia again, not the rise of Russia, more like the ascendance of Russia again out of the nightmare that was the end of the Cold War, and so we have the fragility of the capitalist system. And I think for me, what Putin has shown us as a result of this conflict is that the European dream is a myth. Europe is a joke, and he's shown Europe to be a kind of a fake institution. And so we were sold the lie that Europe was going to be the model. Europe was the future. It was going to be the union of nations. People were going to put aside their national differences and all work together for the common good. That's a nonsense. Europe is a joke. It is a confederation of squabbling, corrupt little countries who hate each other and they can't agree on anything. And so what that means, of course, is that we live in this, I guess, sea of anarchy, and there's competing nation states, and it's every man for himself, effectively. That's really what Putin's conflict has shown us. And with MAGA and with Trump, what Trump is trying to do is he wants to reverse what he sees as, or the American state wants to reverse what they believe is the overzealous concessions made to everyone else. They've always believed in reciprocity. The nonsense that Trump invented reciprocity, that was been around since the 30s. And the idea is that we give what we get. We want a fair deal. We don't want to give people a free lunch. There's no free riding. And so the feeling was that under globalization in the 90s, that America gave much more than it received. And so America wants to in a sense, go back to this idea of fairness, what they see as fairness. And they did that with Japan in the 80s and 70s and 80s. It was very successful. They were able to knock out the Japanese economy. The Japan had 20 years of recession, and they want to do the same to the world now. This is sort of they've just upped the ante. Forget about just taking on China. They're going to give tariffs to everyone. But the idea is that they feel that this is the only way to sustain prosperity. And that's because capitalism is dying. It contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And the lie of free trade, the lie of globalism, And you hear all the time, Dan, I don't know if you follow the globalism nonsense and globalization. That's all a myth. The most important player in the world economy is the American state, followed by Britain, Canada, of course, Russia, China. We live in a system of nation states, and they're all been competing with each other. And what the Americans have been very upset with is that they are not the only kid on the block anymore. That China is a viable competitor. That Taiwan was up until recently the place where you make semiconductors. And the Taiwanese are so scared now that there's going to be war with China that they're making deals with America. So the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company has made a deal of $100 billion investment in America. And there's not even a war yet. So what they're saying is basically, we want to set up shop in America, so when you bomb Beijing, our company will be safe. And so this strategy of America's strategy is essentially to create chaos all around the world, except for America and for America's allies. And so the huge corporations will retreat back to the refuge that is the United States, that is England, that is Australia, that is the places of refuge backed up by the American shield. And the rest of the world, as far as America is concerned, can go to hell. And so that's why, I guess, partly why Trump is not that interested in this Ukraine conflict, because strategically there's nothing in it for the United States. Whereas Britain desperately needs money. It is not the world superpower. It needs to grow economically, and England has many problems. And Starmer sees the war as something that he can get a few more years out of. It'd be good for his re-election. Everyone seems to stand with Ukraine. It's good for morale publicly. It doesn't matter how many Ukrainians die. That he doesn't care about that. The British don't care. The British state doesn't care about that. As long, because the other thing, Dan, is we haven't seen any footage.
That thought came into my mind earlier as we were discussing it. This whole war now is about the politicking. It's not about the footage. There's no day-to-day, because you're not seeing the day-to-day tragedies. It's very light. There'll be like splatterings to remind you it's still there, but it's not in your face. That's been observed, palpable. Absolutely. I mean, I think people's public opinion would shift if they could see suffering every single day.
And that's why there's the outcry over Gaza, because people can see what's happening in Gaza. You can see the footage, you see the destruction, and people are horrified. When I was in Russia back in 2023, I watched the nightly news or the evening news, and you could see the footage of the war. They were showing it every night. And I was told, oh, the Russians, they hate America. And then I went to this corporation that was there. It was a corporation, a little bit like Russia's Amazon, I suppose. And I was thinking, I can hear the English language. Where's that coming from? And up on the screen, there was this huge CNN 24/7 news channel being broadcast. And I thought, here's the myth of Russia, that Russia is paranoid. The Russians, they were watching CNN. And of course, there are all the sanctions on Russia, and what the Russians did, which is what happens when countries leave the global scene, is that they just turn in on themselves and they recreate, in a sense, the same products. And so I went shopping to this huge Russian supermarket. I've never seen a supermarket like this in my life. It was massive. I've never seen so much vodka, so much wine, so much cheese, so much caviar in my life. And what I noticed, a lot of the companies, they weren't bringing in the Western stuff. They were making their own. And so, because the market's there for them now. And so, in a sense, Britain was making Russia great again. And that is really what Starmer's doing. Starmer and his cronies in the British state and also in Europe, they're making Russia great again. And the other thing that I noticed when I was in Russia, and I think it's very pertinent to this discussion, and that is that people don't see Putin as a tyrant. They don't see him as a dictator or a tyrant. They see him as someone who is, I guess, returning Russia to a position that it was in the past, but not to the empire, not this sort of Hitler-like invasion sort of mentality that the West seems to have. It's sort of a rebalancing. Putin is rebalancing Russia, because under Yeltsin, Yeltsin wrecked Russia. He received all bad advice from America. and they did to Russia what the Americans and the British are going to do to the Ukraine, which is to cut it up into little bits and feast on the carcass. And so Yeltsin in a way, betrayed Russia. And as a result, the Russian economy collapsed. And there was a lot of chaos. And I think Yeltsin's last words were in politics, "I'm sorry, I'm tired, I'm going home." So he'd had enough. And so then he appoints Putin. And Putin is rebalancing Russia. And I've never seen so much reconstruction in my life. There's a lot of development going on there. There are a lot of new buildings, a lot of new
yeah, it feels like, I mean, as you're speaking, it
so
feels like there's an absolute media blackout on
yeah.
what's happening in Russia. I mean, a lot of the Russian media has obviously been taken down. I mean, RT News, which was very critical of COVID policies, you can't access RT News now in the UK. You can't get, and I did catch myself recently. My own perception of Russia is largely skewed by the fact of what I've been told. And actually, I realize I have no idea. I have no idea what it's like in Russia. I don't get to see any Russian media. I don't get to see any insights from Russian individuals. I'm sold this perception. And for someone who is liberty-minded and human rights-minded, I have concerns about what I have been told about Russia by the authorities, but I don't know under what authority that is true now, and to what extent that is true. And human rights abuses and lack of free media, lack of democratic elections. I don't know to what extent any of that is true anymore. But I'm beginning to ask questions. But at the same time, with regards to the war, at least, there's no Russian side of the story permitted at the citizen level, let alone at the state level. So from your time there, you said you were there in 2023. So, right within this conflict, what's the view of the Russian people themselves on the conflict? How do they feel about it?
Well, Russia is such a huge place; it's incredible. It's
Massive.
the largest I think it's the largest landmass or country in the world. And where I was sort of closer to Siberia than to Ukraine, but it's not really. It wasn't really being talked about by people. People were just getting on with their lives. I suspect had I visited towns or cities close to the Ukrainian border, there would definitely be more conversation. I did speak to a number of people about the conflict, but it wasn't something that was on their minds all the time. I think it's like with when we were at war in the Middle East for 20 years. We were bombing Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria back to the Stone Age. And then we were persecuting Muslims here in Australia. People weren't talking about the war much at all. It was just, unless, of course, there was some kind of terrorist attack or whatever. But it really wasn't on our lips. We didn't talk about it that much. And I think conflict does that in a sense. So I think when I did ask people, they would talk about it, but it wasn't really in the way that we talk about conflict. It wasn't. It was more their emotional response to the conflict. I guess maybe it's a little bit hard to explain, but we tend to be. What I found, the Russian people were kind of very pragmatic about the way they talk about the world, whereas we've become very ideological in a sense that we package everything we say with the right phrases, the right terms, the right ideas. And I think for us, we'd say, what sort of political when I ask someone what do they think about the Ukrainian war, I'm really asking them what's their ideological stance. Whereas if you ask a Russian, what do you think about the Ukrainian war, they're thinking, well, how does it impact me? How does it impact my family? And those kinds of things. And so they're not thinking in terms of ideology at all. They're thinking in terms of interpersonal relations. And that's an old-fashioned, I would say that's an old-fashioned pre-ideology kind of way of thinking about the world. What we've done is we've made every conversation ideological. We can't even have a beer with a friend without it turning into an argument about stand with Ukraine or some other COVID hysteria. But the other thing that we have to remember with the stand with Ukraine is that when this war is over, and it will end, and there will be a treaty, all the people who said that stand with Ukraine will never say it again. It will
Totally.
disappear from their
Yep.
vocabulary, and they will spin it and say, "Well, actually, I've always believed in peace. I've always liked that, Mr. Putin," because we know that's exactly what they said with COVID. The same people who were telling us, "I'll never talk to you because you're not vaccinated. You can go to hell. I hate you, blah, blah, blah. You don't ever talk to me again." As soon as COVID was over, they're saying, "Let's catch up for lunch." What? I thought we were we were enemies for life. No, no, no. You got it wrong. I wasn't really that committed to the vaccine and to the mandates, and so that is, in a sense, I guess, the upside to this, in a sense, because I don't think that, unlike some maybe North Korea, the ideology of the state is not that effective. I know that there's a lot of talk about the effectiveness of indoctrination, but that's the kind of indoctrination we have. Under COVID, it was there for a time, a season, and then people have forgotten about it. It's shifted like a plague or a black cloud onto Ukraine, and it dissipated with Gaza because there's so much disagreement over Gaza. It's not a plain, it's not a simple yes or no, because there's so much enmity and hatred in that part of the world. And so, in a way, because there's no agreement in Gaza, it's fallen back onto Ukraine again. And if you remember, all of last year, people had forgotten about the Ukraine entirely. No one was talking about the Ukraine until Trump was elected, and he said, "Oh, we really should have a peace treaty." And then everyone's gone back to their default position. No, no, stand with Ukraine. Let's fight. Let's fight. And but in a couple of years' time, you won't find anyone who stands with Ukraine or stands with Russia. This whole thing will be gone. My great fear is, what is the next loyalty
And I actually remember the moment I was talking to friends of mine in the kind of freedom space who have been very active, and I said it was like turning a newspaper page. It was like yesterday's edition was all about COVID, and then the next day it was completely gone. There was nothing. I mean, the news cycle completely eliminated COVID from the storylines. It's like, we're not talking about that anymore. And it wasn't just like one establishment. It was like all of the mainstream media. It's like, we're not going to roll with that story anymore. It's done. That story is done. And then it was like, boom, turn the page. It's Ukraine now. Like, that was it. It was like overnight. That's the storyline. We're going to forget about COVID now. It's not driving our revenue anymore. There's not enough moral outrage, and we've reached the tail end of this story now. This now is the story where the moral outrage is, and if it enrages, it engages, and it's going to sell us. It's going to sell us more papers. It's going to sell us more advertising, and that's how the cycle goes. And you're absolutely right. Once this Ukraine story plays out and there is an agreement in place, and that, like, they're not going to want to shine a light on the feasting of Ukraine, because that would violate everyone's own then internal dialogue of, I stand with Ukraine. Because if you really do stand with Ukraine and you want to keep wearing that flag, you're going to have to defend them against that corporatization of their nation, which you won't. Like, the people watching this who are like, I stand with Ukraine, I can guarantee your attention will be drawn away to something else. I stand with the latest thing, will be the next thing. And you're absolutely right. What could that be? I could speculate, you and I could speculate. But there will be a next thing, because the news cycle, feast and famine on moral outrage. And that's partly why I actually think the greatest war right now is the war of ideas, because it has become ideology versus rationality. And this entire discussion for me around the war and moving towards peace, the rational argument, the strategic argument is, how do we go to negotiation as swiftly as possible and minimize the collateral damage? Like, that is the rational strategic argument. The ideological argument is, let's prolong the war until justice is served. And people can't see past negotiation. They can't see war tribunals. They can't see international criminal courts, because that action is still possible. There is different ways to achieve justice. But it's the ideological, heavily emotionalized argument supersedes the rational. And people, they go, well, what about World War II? It's like, well, World War II ended in treaties. It was still negotiation. It wasn't just like Hitler fell and that was that. It still required negotiations, treaties, and almost every war ends in negotiation and treaties. So it's like, how long do you want to ride it out? How much more damage do you want to have for the outcome to potentially be materially, like, 1% different from what it is today? Which it infuriates me, Michael, as you can tell. But I think that's the deeper battle that we're actually facing. So the next storyline will be another emotionalized, ideological, moral outrage. Moral
Absolutely.
absolutism,
Yep.
where any nuance, any discussion is gone. It's tribalized, and you're either on that team or that team, and you're not anywhere in between. And the people who are anywhere in between just withdraw. They just don't engage because it's too dangerous. Because if you say something to the contrary, you're going to get called a Puritanite, or you're going to get called an anti-vaxxer, or you're going to get called whatever. So it's you can't win if you're on the side of nuance, if you're on the side of understanding. But at the same time, in closing, I'm actually interested in this because your perspective on this, because actually when someone is deeply emotionally and ideologically engaged in something, then as we saw during COVID, facts don't matter. Like, facts do not matter. Facts, data, statistics. In the case of war, history doesn't matter. Complexity doesn't matter when you're emotionally engaged. And I think that's why that, as you alluded to, is when COVID ended and this news cycle ended, people then started to say, "Oh, let's hang out again," because the emotion had gone. It had been taken out of it. It deflated, and it's like now you can. It's almost like you're out of that intensity cycle, so you can actually think logically again. And it feels like that will happen eventually with the Ukraine conflict as well. But it will, as you say, fall into the next thing. My question to you is, how do we break that cycle? And actually, how do we start to dance between logic and emotion again? Because you can't ignore the emotional side of human experience. And actually, my fear is that the longer we go failing to acknowledge someone's emotional position, it's almost like that nail in the head. Have you seen that video with like the lady with the nail in the head? And she's like, it's so painful. It's so painful. The man is just like, let me pull it out for you, my love. Let me pull that nail out. The pain will go away. And she's like, you just don't get me. You don't understand what I'm going through. Because he doesn't acknowledge the pain she's got. All she wanted was, in this video, which is a stereotype and a generalization, but all she wanted was comfort that she's got pain in her head. She didn't want the guy to pull it out for her.
Yeah.
And we're almost in the same position. It's like we don't actually acknowledge the emotional argument, therefore it gets grander and grander and grander, and therefore logic is further and further away. So how do we rebalance? How do we end the war between emotion, ideology, and rationality and logic, so that we have a better balance, so that you can actually symbiotically still feel emotional about something, but still be rational? Like, how do we restore that balance in your view?
That's a really, really good question, Dan, and a really big one.
God, no, 8 minutes. 5 minutes.
I just wanted to say that for those who are standing with Ukraine, don't worry, the real invasion has yet to begin. Once the negotiation is over, the real invasion will take place, and Ukraine will be invaded with the investment and the slicing up of that country. But don't worry, we won't be thinking about that anymore once the negotiation is over. But it's a difficult question, I think. I started Freedom Matters Today in 2021, and I really tried to wrestle with the idea of, I guess, fascism and tyranny. And what I discovered was that, unfortunately, fascism has its origins in the church state. And my research on the history of European history, that effectively that's what fascism was. It was this marriage of church and state, and where, I guess, the ideology of religion had become part of the institution of government. And as a result, you have the religious wars and so on. And so finally, we're out of that. And for me, I then moved on to trying to understand Christian nationalism, and then I guess Ukraine, and then Gaza last year, and World War III. I wrote a book on World War III, and I'm trying to understand what does it mean to be a Christian and how to relate to all of these issues. Because I found that when I was writing Freedom from Fascism, I wanted to anchor my discussion in the identity of Jesus, which was a verse that I found that Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." And that's a very controversial statement for those who are not Christians, but even for those who are Christians. But for me, I needed to anchor my discussion in the life of Jesus, because for me, Jesus is everything, and I believe he's the person, the presence, and power of God. And so I found I kept coming back to that anchor, and I found that the more I focused on the world and tried to see things from, I guess, other perspectives, the more I was able to keep coming back to the anchor, which was my faith, and I found that the more I focused on the politics, the angrier I became. And because you feel the injustice, you feel and it wells up inside of you with the COVID hysteria and the rubbish of the government and the rubbish of the war in Ukraine and the nonsense of the war in Gaza. And this anger this sort of, when Jesus went through the temple with the whip and he's smashing things and kicking tables, and we say, oh, that's really a little bit too much, Jesus. But he felt this righteous anger, and we feel that righteous anger with all the evil of the world today. But at the same time, that's all emotional in a way. Like we're going through that emotional trauma, and we need to ground ourselves in something solid that keeps us going every day. And for me, I realized that the answer wasn't really talking about politics anymore. And I thought I'd go back to the New Testament, and I would focus exclusively on the life of Jesus. And I put together a 4-year program. I call it Jesus for Busy People, which is the idea we're going to have a micro podcast series of a subscription based thing where you have a little talk about Jesus every day. And my plan is to keep it running until I die. So the goal is this is long term. And I came up with 3 principles of life. And the first one was authenticity. And authenticity is important because that's how other people view us. It's not how we view ourselves. Authenticity is of how other people see us. And that's very important because it means that how we live is important. Our choices matter. We are accountable beings. We're responsible beings, and so on. I think if we accept that we are responsible, that we can't blame the government. We can't say, oh, the government's indoctrinating. No, we know we're responsible for those choices. And that informs the authenticity. And the second aspect is spirituality. And the more I read the Bible, I realized Jesus had this really deep spirituality, talking about his Father in heaven. And he's always talking about his Father in heaven and this relationship he has with God. And so for me, spirituality is another grounding anchor that I'm not the center of the universe, that I need to, I guess, ponder my relationship with the divine, that I need to see beyond myself and get out of the narcissism, the materialism, the consumerism, and try to see beyond myself. And if my world is only me, then I'm part of that ideological nonsense. I get swept away like a cork in an ocean. And the third aspect is identity. I wrote a book called The Pronouns of God, which I'm surprised hasn't been banned yet, but give Amazon time.
Well, I don't know. Jeff Bezos says it's changed his tune now recently, so maybe not. Yeah, he's bought the Washington Post and said he needs to write about liberty and rights. It's like, hang on a minute. You literally cancelled all the books about that.
Yeah. Absolutely, some amazing. Yeah. He's at his road to Damascus. The same with Elon Musk, but the identity is that's how we view ourselves. And for Jesus, he had this very strong sense of identity, and so he believed himself to be the Son of God, the Son of Man, I suppose. And for us, so for me, identity is very important. Now, I don't subscribe to the woke agenda. So when I'm talking about identity, I'm talking about I guess a biblical idea of identity. I was going to say that I had a little phrase there for Europe, that Europe only believes in 3 things. It was woke, waste, and war. I think that sort of sums up Europe. And that's what a lot of the European countries are realizing. They're thinking, why did we join up to this project? They all they care about is, let's fight a transgender war, or I don't know. And then there's similar values to what Russia's promoting, and they believe in 2 genders, and now Trump has come out and said the same thing. And so there's this pendulum swinging back again to a more, I guess, traditional understanding of the world. And so for me, I needed to find an anchor in the life of Jesus, and so I returned to the New Testament. And so for me, that really is the anchor for me. And as I read the New Testament, I realized Jesus is actually not this weak, effeminate kind of bloke. He's a counter-revolutionary. He's a radical. He's a rebel. And that's why they crucified him after 3 years, because he stood up to COVID hysteria. He rebelled against the stand with Ukraine. He made the right choice. But whenever you make a choice and you make a stand for truth, you will be persecuted. And if you're saying something and no one is paying attention, you're on the wrong path. If you want to stand up for truth, and I think that for Jesus, is calling us to be people of peace, but he's also calling us to be authentic people. And the only way we can do that is to stand up for the truth. And when we see injustice or we see the errors of our society, that we must stand for the truth. And we do it because I believe we have to stand before God one day and give an account of our life. But also, if you have children and grandchildren, you want to say to your kids, I did the right thing. And that means something, because kids and children and the next generation need to know that some things matter and some things are important, because our government says we can buy you. How much do we have to pay you? And with these loyalty tests and so on, all we have is this, I guess, ideology. And what it's replaced is that we've lost a sense of masculinity. We've lost a sense of family. We've lost a sense of identity. We've been, as I said before, we've given ourselves to the government. We've somehow in the last generation or so, we've conferred power. We've enslaved ourselves, and we need to be set free. And I believe Jesus can set us free. But I think ultimately we need to continue to challenge, and we need to continue to stand for truth. And the longer you stand for truth, the more persecution you'll get. And I hope and pray that there will be peace in the Ukraine. And the thing that I would say is that we should forget the stand with Ukraine, absolutely, but we should never forget the people who have suffered in this war, and there are millions of them, and we should, if we can do anything, start an association of helping those who have come back from that war, be it Russian or Ukrainian, or even the foreign services soldiers who have served, because war has this terrible impact that goes for the rest of life, and we need to stand with the veterans, and we need to stand with those who've come back from war and not forget them. And I think that's vitally important too, as we should stand with the victims of COVID and the people who've suffered during COVID, the ones we're being told to forget about. So I gave the story of the soldier in the Vietnam War. There was another priest in Sydney. I'm an Anglican minister, but I've gone independent. I've gone rogue. I'm not part of the church anymore. I've set up Freedom Matters Today. They're very much against that. I believe, and so for me, I believe, like Wesley, that the world is my congregation, the world is my parish, and that I don't have any favourites. I see everyone made in the image of God. Everyone's loved by God. And everyone is someone for whom Christ died and whom God loves. But there was this soldier who was a chaplain. He was in the Pacific, and his entire platoon were wiped out. And he used to give the Anzac Day service in Sydney every year, but they had to wait for an hour every year because he was out the back in the vestry crying. And so this is again another man who he was the last member of his platoon. And he struggled with what it meant to be a Christian minister, and what it meant to forgive, and what it meant to, I guess, love his enemies. And I thought, well, that's a tragedy. But at the same time, right at the end of the war, the British government, the Australian government, the American government, and the Russian government were busy getting as many Nazi war criminals as they could to fight the Cold War. And so here you have the victims of war, the ones who fought and died, versus the politicians, the ruling class members, the scientists, and those who had no compassion whatsoever. And so for me, all war is evil, all war is a sin. And we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. And we must, every time we see someone else, they're made in the image of God, and they're someone God loves.
Reverend Dr. Michael John Sutton, the rebel priest. Thank you so much for being with us here today, and for that closing message. I think I'd like to ask you one closing question just to wrap up. Regardless of someone's own religious inclination or faith, how would you guide people to apply that closing wisdom into their lives so that they can contribute each day to peace within themselves and outside of themselves, rather than contribute to conflict?
I think that's a really good question. I think that in a practical sense, we can change the lives of people around us. We can't change the world. We can change our own lives and those whom we love and our friends. I think authenticity is very important. To be people of authenticity, people of integrity. I'm not really talking about married with 2 kids. I'm talking about just general authenticity. Someone who's known to be someone who is honest and true, and also to be people of to know who they are. And I remember one of your I listened to a few of your podcasts before coming on, and there was one guy, I can't remember his name, but he was saying that in COVID, a lot of people were reacting to the loss of freedoms, but they didn't replace it with anything because they didn't know what they believed. And I think that we do need to be settled people, and at some point in our life, we need to sit down and think, well, what do I believe? Why am I here? What's this about? And I think this settled understanding of who you are and what you want to do in life is very important as an adult. And I'd encourage people to consider the life of Jesus, but many people don't. And for them, I'd say you have to be true to yourself. And you have to be someone who is known to be someone who's reliable and trustworthy, but also someone who listens. There's a lot of talking, we live in the age of the chatterboxes and people who talk. And also everyone seems to think that they're right all the time. And that's one of the problems. Yeah. There's no humility. And we need to be a little bit humble, and that I don't know everything. I mean, I've did a lot of preparation for this talk too. And I hope we had a good conversation. A lot of things I don't know. And a part of that is my education and upbringing. We weren't taught grammar at school when the government decided we won't teach grammar. I didn't know about the history of Australia. That we were lied to about that. But we do need to understand our own history, and we do need to understand who we are. I think that we should, in a practical sense, find someone we don't like in our community, someone that we've had an argument with in the past, and say, look, let's have a chat. Let's see if we can find common ground. I remember, if we have a little bit of time, but just briefly, I ran a Bible study years ago, and there were 2 guys in it who hated each other's guts. They despised each other. And every week we had the argument. They argued and argued and argued. And I thought, these guys are never going to find anything in common. But they both came across the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. And one of them said at the end of a year-long worth of arguing, he said, this is my favorite book of the Bible. I really love this book. This book really speaks to me. And his enemy, his nemesis, said, I agree. I agree. This is exactly. And these two enemies suddenly became friends, and they had this bond of friendship that I've never seen before. 2 grown men who literally argued every week. And I think we can find people. I think we do need to build a community and build relationships with people with whom we disagree, because I do believe there is common ground, even with people we think we see as our enemies. And so if you're a rabid libertarian, I encourage you to find a Marxist and get to know them. If you're a Muslim, find a Christian. If you're a Jew, find a Palestinian, and build these bonds, build these communities, because that's the only way as a civilization we will survive, because what holds us together is far more important than what drives us apart. And I think that's really what it's about. I spent 10 years in Japan, and I have great respect for Buddhism and Buddhists. Most of my friends in Japan, I have a very good friend who's a Buddhist priest. He's one of my oldest friends, and we often talk about things and about faith and about life. And he respects me, I respect him. We both have this great bond. And it's last time I was in Japan, we went there, and we were having a chat and a talk, and we were singing hymns in his temple. And I thought, here he is, this Buddhist priest welcoming us into his home and showing that hospitality. And at the end of the day, we're all people, and we're all made in the image of God. And there needs to be a lot more, I guess, calm. But I do encourage people, if you're not a Christian, if you're not a person of faith, find someone you really dislike. Maybe it could be your relative, one of your relatives you just can't stand. Maybe everyone has that uncle, don't they? So sort of that uncle they don't like, or this relative. Find that person and get to know them and build that friendship, because that's how we move together as a society. And as I said, we can't let the government enslave us. We have to be free, and it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. But freedom is ultimately something that we really must have, and we can
Thank
have
you,
each day.
Michael. And on that point, I just want to make sure people are aware of your Freedom Matters today, and what it's all about, and how people can connect with that, and the work that you've mentioned today. You've talked about your Jesus for Busy People, I think was the title. Tell us a little bit about the two things you've got, or the work that you're doing right now, and how people can connect with that and yourself.
Well, freedommatterstoday.com is the website. Please subscribe, send us your email, and you can subscribe to the newsletter. You'll find out there about Jesus for Busy People, which will be hopefully starting in Easter this year. The goal is looking at freedom, and then identity, spirituality, and authenticity. And this will be a micro podcasting, I think it's called. And so I encourage you to do that. All my books are available through Amazon. Amazon's banned some of the advertising, but graciously they've kindly let me sell the books through Amazon. My manifesto is this one, which is a slightly naughty book, I suppose, with the title and the World War III, Will You Stand for Peace? There's a T-34 Russian tank on the front. And that's my manifesto. And another book which has been banned by Amazon, Does God Stand with Israel? And there's St. Stephen being stoned by the Jews, and the stained glass window on the front. And those two books are really great. One's about Gaza, looks at Gaza from a Christian perspective, looks at Christian Zionism and other things. And I try to look at Abraham and the life of Abraham. But ultimately, I'm trying to move away from the politics and looking more at the person of Jesus. And so that's what Jesus for Busy People is. And so my slogan is no agenda, no politics, just Jesus. So hopefully that's what it will
good
be.
Luck on that journey in a political world. It's very hard to separate. So I wish you all well on that journey. And I think, for my takeaway, actually, you remind me about coming to those fundamentals, those principles, those what I would call global beliefs, not situational beliefs about your belief about any particular circumstance or individual. Actually, what do you fundamentally, principally stand for? Because I think people are actually in conflict with their own principles right now. We touched about, bad orange man, and I put a post out this morning about people who have long-standing, they consider themselves to be someone who stands for peace, but they can't support Trump's version of peace because they don't like Trump, even if they don't know why they don't like Trump, but they've been told they don't like Trump and their friends don't like Trump. So you can't like Trump at Trump's peace plan because that side you with Trump. So that's going to cause massive disconnect for people, because actually fundamentally they stand for principle of peace, but they can't stand for it because their tribal identity has taken them away from that. So actually that authentic identity enables them to say, you know what, I'm going to be the rock in the river. I don't care what people think about Trump. I don't have to like Trump. I can compartmentalize it and say, actually, this part of the thing he's doing, I can like, and similarly, I can dislike that. And I take that view of all politicians. I've always been politically homeless. I've never aligned with a political party or politician. So it allows me to stand back and go, I like that, I don't like that, and I really don't like that. And okay, I can cheer that bit on. And it allows you to be free to actually do the right thing in accordance with your own principles. And your principles may change over time, because you learn, you grow, you get wiser, hopefully. Even if society seems to be going the other direction, wisdom seems to have been forgotten. But it gives us that opportunity to actually live in accordance with our authentic self, which has been a beautiful reminder, Michael. So thank you, Reverend Dr. Michael J. Sutton, who's been with us today. Please do check out those links. All the links that we talked about there will be in the description wherever you're listening or watching. So just look below this video and you'll find those links and ways to connect with Michael's work. So it's been a real privilege and honor. I know it's late now if you're recording. I didn't actually check that you're in Australia right now recording this, but if you are, it's going to be late, probably past your bedtime. But
No.
Thank you for being with us late here, and I do appreciate this. And for our audience at home, please do share this. This is an important conversation, and even if you disagree with what we've talked about, in alignment with Michael's principle, let's actually look for the commonalities. Let's look for those commonalities, and in order to find that, we have to be willing to entertain different perspectives. So it's my hope that you'll share this, and appreciate those of you who stayed with us right to the end. And if you'd like to be part of our group, the Live Free and Prosper community, where we stand for freedom, but we also stand for the value of human connection, then please do check out the Live Free and Prosper community at Astin-Gregory.com/supporter, and you can support our work and help us to continue conversations like this. So thanks again to Michael, and thanks to everyone at home. My name's Dan Astin-Gregory, and this is the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast.